Welcome to Music Discovery. This series is about listening closely to albums that reveal something deeper the more attention we give them. Today we're exploring Victorialand by Cocteau Twins, released on this date in 1986. I first heard this album when it was released in 1986. By then I was in the habit of checking out the import bins at all the local record stores in my native Los Angeles. I was already deeply into Cocteau Twins by this point, having their previous 3 albums, 7 EPs, and their first compilation album, The Pink Opaque, all on vinyl. This album, and 1986 in general, were an interesting turning point for Cocteau Twins. In January, their first compilation album was released, The Pink Opaque. Then on April 14th, Victorialand was released. It was different from anything else the band had released up to that point. For the recording of this album, Cocteau Twins was just Elizabeth Fraser on vocals and Robin Guthrie on guitar, bass, drum machine, and keyboards. Their bass player at the time, Simon Raymond, was unavailable as he was working on another project. Fraser and Guthrie had recorded on their own before in 1983 following the departure of their first bass player, Will Hedgie, who departed to form his own band, Low Life. Their sound back in 1983 was quite different, and resulted in the album Head Over Hills and the EP Sunburst and Snowblind being much darker and more angular. Harsh and abrasive, yet still ethereal. Now, for Victorialand, the music was much more rhythmic. But the layered guitars drive the rhythms on this album. The use of their typical drum machine was severely restricted on this album, appearing subtly and only on a couple of tracks. Later in 1986, Fraser and Guthrie, reunited with their bass player Raymond, released their final EP of these earlier years, Love's Easy Tears. A quick listen to even the first few seconds of any of the 4 tracks on this EP will show you what the full band sounded like, with Raymond's signature bass sound and the return of prominent drum machine parts. Towards the end of 1986, Fraser, Guthrie, and Raymond released an album with the American minimalist composer Harold Budd called The Moon in the Melodies. This is an amazing collaboration, and I'll be covering it later in the year on its anniversary. Following this, no new Cocteau Twins music was released for nearly 2 years, and the next series of albums, from 1988 onward, were quite different sonically. As I mentioned, Victorialand is a highly rhythmic album, but the rhythm is driven by the guitars. Guthrie uses highly treated guitars, but the result is never muddy. The production is quite clear, and you can usually easily identify the individual guitar parts. That said, there is a lot of textural overlapping of guitars and effects. If you're familiar with Cocteau Twins at all, you'll of course be familiar with Elizabeth Fraser's vocals. But in case you're not, a few things need to be said. First, she has one of the most beautiful voices in the history of music. That's not an overstatement. Countless artists have spoken about her voice and her peculiar way of singing. She seldom sings in English, instead preferring to make up her own languages or sing in other languages she doesn't know, making up the sounds as she goes along. Notable guest appearances have included her work with This Mortal Coil, including her cover of Tim Buckley's Song to the Siren, which was featured in the film Lost Highway by David Lynch and the film The Lovely Bones. If you haven't heard that track, and you should, you've probably heard her collaboration with Massive Attack, where she performs on 3 tracks on their album Mezzanine, including their well-known track Teardrop. Anyway, back to Victorialand. Fraser's vocals shift between soaring, shimmering glossolalias and more rhythmic chanting and incantations that echo Guthrie's guitars. On the track Feet Like Fins, the delay effect on the guitars is otherworldly. The cymbal rolls complement the incessant rhythm nicely. Later we hear tablas as several counterpoints occur simultaneously. The Thinner the Air is the first and only track to feature prominent keyboards in addition to the constant rhythmic driving of the guitars. At 33 minutes, the 9 songs on Victorialand seem to fly by, but it's a very cohesive album. Cocteau Twins made music that is timeless, roughly between 1982 and 1996. They've influenced generations of musicians across genres, from Slow Life to Prince, and countless others. If you haven't heard this album before, I encourage you to spend some time with it. And if you have, I'd love to hear what you notice when you listen again.